Hello, my name is Albert Pionke. I'm the William and Margaret Going Endowed Professor of English at the University of Alabama and the founding director and principal investigator of Mill Marginalia Online. This digital humanities initiative aspires to digitize and render fully searchable all nonverbal marks and verbal annotations in the roughly 1,700 bound volumes of 19th century philosopher, liberal theorist, and social and aesthetic critic John Stuart Mill's personal library, currently held as a special collection at Oxford University's Somerville College. Mill Marginalia Online began with a public call put out by Somerville in November 2014 for technical and research collaborators. I responded, we corresponded, I visited for the first time in July 2015, and then I began to work with the professional, managerial, and technical staff at the University of Alabama Digital Humanities Center to figure out what to do with the data I had collected. Over the next 3 years, during which my team and I plotted our computational and intellectual strategies, I made several more data collection trips, recruited an international advisory board, applied for funding from local and national sources, and began to report on initial research results at various academic conferences. I enumerate these steps not because they were particularly original or virtuous on my part, but rather because they're the kinds of things that one should expect to do when designing and implementing a new DH initiative. Technology may move quickly, but bringing a project like this one to light is less of a sprint and more of a collective endurance race in which everyone must make it across the finish line together. My own collaborators, foreign and domestic, have included the archivists, librarians, and head of information services at Somerville, the associate dean and metadata librarian of UA's university libraries, as well as successive directors and dedicated programming specialists of the Digital Humanities Center. In addition, the project has also employed, at this point, 9 undergraduate and graduate research assistants, all of whom help to discover, process, transcribe, and categorize the growing volume and variety of data. The roughly 25% of marginalia in Somerville's collection photographed and transcribed thus far has added a delightfully human dimension to Mill's rather cerebral public persona. When Mill disagreed with something, he could be downright snarky. Ralph Waldo Emerson's essays came in for particularly rough treatment. After finding them stupid and very stupid in his initial comments, Mill creatively compiled many of his juiciest criticisms into a rewritten title page, transforming Emerson's work into, quote, philosophy bourgeois being sentimental essays in the art of intimately blending sense and nonsense, and Emerson himself into, quote, a clever and well-organized youth of from 20 to 60, brought up in the old traditions, motto in thought, all's fish that comes to net. Ouch. When Mill Marginalia Online launched in April 2018, it had grown organically into something more than any of us had initially envisioned. Most noticeably, our original plans to design the user interface around a NoSQL database shifted to a hybrid of the SQL and NoSQL formats. It turned out that a dataset that everyone had predicted in 2015 would run into the low thousands had grown to a documented 12,000 by 2016 and a projected 40 to 50,000 by 2017. This rapid growth meant that a pure NoSQL database would be unacceptably slow and memory-intensive to search for our hoped-for users. At the same time, the fact that I kept returning to Somerville periodically to collect ever more data, which then needed to be uploaded and merged with the existing content, also required more flexibility than a pure relational SQL database could provide. These repeated trips also kept uncovering ever more categories of marginalia, rendering existing classification schemes insufficient to the data. Thus, score, the term used to distinguish a vertical line most often drawn in the margin, metastasized into single, double, and triple lines, not to mention corrugated, dotted, tailed, and tallied varieties. We found smudges, idle marks, idle shading, squiggles, and doodles. Every trip discovered a half-dozen new ways that John Stuart Mill, his father James Mill, and others recorded their initial encounters with the printed ideas. Rather than trying to fit the data to a Procrustean bed of established categories, we allowed it to determine our system of classification, which remains an organic work in progress. Differences between what we had planned and what we ultimately decided to do also arose as a result of transitioning from a planning process that was overwhelmingly verbal, talking through various options at meetings, exchanging emails, and drafting documents, to an implementation phase that was primarily visual. We had originally described the metadata categories in words, but it ultimately made much more sense to render them as representative images. Our authors were recorded as names in spreadsheets, but it seemed much more appealing to represent them with portraits whenever they were available. This did occasionally lead to amusing errors, as when 18th century philosopher John Brown was briefly conflated with his 19th century abolitionist counterpart, but this was an easy fix, even if it did force us to abandon a quite striking image with Harper's Ferry in the background. We also talked a great deal about the best layout for the actual page images, but it was not until I could see a mock-up that I fully understood both how powerful a simple left-to-right progression could be, or how varying the colors of the different marginalia types would make it much easier to discern at a glance what one should look for on a given page. Here, as elsewhere, I discovered that other members of my team were frequently not just more knowledgeable technically than I, but were also often better designers. Our planning meetings sometimes evolved into episodes of Geek Eye for the Text Guy, and I was almost always delighted to be on the receiving end of a makeover. Throughout this long development process, all of us prioritized transparency and the facilitation of future research. Thus, it is possible for users to download the metadata for individual volumes directly. This one function complements the Creative Commons licenses that cover all content on the site. Basically, all text, from transcriptions to critical introductions, is pre-approved for use, provided that you give us credit. The same is true for the metadata schema and the database encoding, which we currently store on GitHub. Pictures require permission, in part because the intellectual property that they represent belongs to Somerville, which is understandably unwilling to give carte blanche to allowing images of their library or their books to be used for profit. Ask to use an image in your next scholarly book or article, however, and we're almost certain to say yes. There will be no charge if we do. Transparency also extends beyond the data and the technology used to view it. Our project blog attempts to provide a forum for everyone involved in Mill Marginalia Online to tell you a bit more about what they're doing. For instance, we have a lovely set of posts from the Oxford Conservancy Consortium, which is doing marvelous work to conserve the physical books. That way, if the project's virtual taste whets rather than sates your scholarly appetite, the material objects will be there, ready for use when you're next in Oxford. If you would like to learn more about Mill Marginalia Online, please visit our website, millmarginalia.org. You can also read about the project on BBC Online, The Conversation, Daily New, The Guardian, the Victorian Web, and other sites. And not only John Stuart Mill or James Mill specialists are welcome. The project offers a statistically significant amount of data capable of supporting period-specific research in bibliography, paleography, linguistics, periodical studies, literacy practices, aesthetics, intellectual history, and other humanities fields. In closing, I hope that this narrative of Mill Marginalia Online's progressive revision can help to prepare future project directors for the organic and necessarily flexible approach that will almost certainly be required to implement their own DH initiatives.